Okay, 1 o'clock Thursday. So we're going to get into composition. So let's get settled in here. As we get closer to Easter break, families are going to be going on vacation. So I just want everybody to know, and I've said this before, that I'm going to continue having meetings and live classes until the end of March when spring break starts. So there's nothing to worry about. If you're interested in attending, I'm going to keep having meetings. The recordings will be available for those who don't attend, but I'm going to make them every day because I want to make those recordings available. So today we're going to continue studying English composition, getting into a new and important topic, which is the lesson 4 in the course called Essentials of Expression. So we're going to take a look at this and talk about some important concepts. And I want to encourage you to think about your future studies, because the content we talk about today in this chapter on essentials for expression, this is the whole point of the study of rhetoric. So if you look at the Academy curriculum and you see the rhetoric course, and we study Aristotle's art of rhetoric, what we talk about today, this is the whole point of the study of rhetoric. So if you get into this topic and you're interested in it and you want to get better at it, this composition course is great. But if you really want to get into the philosophy of these things, you've got to study Aristotle's art of rhetoric. It's a challenging study, but that's really the difference between becoming a master at these things and simply knowing what a school student knows about them. So anyway, if you find this lesson interesting, you may be interested in continuing into Aristotle's rhetoric. So let me share my screen and we'll get going here with this lesson. The topic of lesson 4 is essentials of expression. Hopefully you can see that on your screen. I'll zoom in a little bit more. Essentials of expression. And we find that there's a really simple lesson taught in this chapter of the book, that there are 2 essentials for the proper expression of ideas. In other words, when you come to speaking or writing, there are really only 2 things that you need to learn and practice. 2 things, 2 essentials of proper expression. And we read them right here in the lesson, right in the first sentence. First, to say what you mean, and second, to say it clearly. That's all there is. That's all there is to speaking or writing effectively. You have to say what you mean, and secondly, you need to say it clearly. And I'm going to rephrase these to make them even better. I'm going to say, first, have something to say, and second, say it well. Those are the 2 rules of speaking and writing. Have something to say and say it well. Most people can't write, can't speak because they don't have anything to say. They don't have an answer to the question. They don't have a solution to the problem. They really don't study. They don't have much information to share with others. They don't have anything to say. So of course they can't write or speak well. And when you're young, for you guys, that's your normal experience. You're not going to be good speakers or good writers because you're just you're young, you don't have much experience in life, and you don't have much to say yet. And that's the point of your studies, is to work to develop the knowledge and awareness of as many subjects as possible, so that you actually have something to say. You have something to contribute to the conversation. You have solutions, you have answers. You read the writings of wise men and learn the answers from them, and then share them with others. That's the whole point of your studies, is to have something to share. Saint Dominic founded a religious order, the Dominicans, which you probably know about. And the rule, or the motto of the Dominican order, is to contemplate or to study and to share the fruits of that contemplation. That's the motto of the Dominican order. That's how life works. So when you wonder, why should I study this or why should I study that? It's not necessarily for your sake. You know, that's what you've got to learn to think about. It's not necessarily for your sake that you're studying this or that. There are a lot of things that I need to study, for example, that I have no interest in, but I have to study them because they're helpful to other people. They allow me to help and serve other people. And so there's more to studying. Studying is much more central to a religious life than just getting your schoolwork done and getting your credits or getting your grades for school. It's also how you become useful to other people, and your motivation to study should be to help other people. If you're blessed with intellectual gifts and mental strength where you can study and learn things and read difficult books, and you've got access to help to get into complicated studies that other people can't get into, you need to learn that one of the reasons you're studying these things is you're going into these studies and learning these things for the sake of other people, so that you can turn around and help people with the things that you've learned. When a doctor goes, when a young man goes to medical school, usually men who are in medical school are perfectly healthy. So why go to medical school? Obviously, he's not going to medical school for his own sake. He's going to medical school to go and study all kinds of sicknesses and diseases, and to study the remedies for those diseases and the causes of those diseases, so that he can help people who have those diseases. He's not doing it for his own sake. Sure, there may be some benefit for him. He earns a salary, but he can find other ways to earn a salary. That's really not what motivates becoming a doctor. Ultimately, you go to study to learn, to help other people. That's what should motivate your studies, and that's true for all areas of life. No matter what you're interested in, you should realize that going into these studies, learning things in any field for the sake of other people, for the sake of how you're going to help other people, that's the real motivation for study. Okay, so the first thing about expression is you have to have something to say. You have to have something to say, and that comes as a result of study and as a result of experience. And when you're young, you have neither of those things, so you don't have too much to say. And by your studies and your work and your experience over time, especially if you pay attention to what's going on around you, you gain more and more experience, more and more knowledge through your studies, and you have more and more to say. And that automatically makes your speaking and writing more effective. Even if you're not a good writer, even if you're not a good speaker, if you've got lots of knowledge and experience, your speech and writing will be valuable simply because you have knowledge and experience that other people don't have, and they want to learn from you. Even if you're a terrible speaker, and you can find all kinds of examples of famous people, who people will make great sacrifices to listen to and learn from, who are terrible speakers or terrible writers. And the reason why they're valued is simply because of their experience and knowledge. So the first thing is you have to have something to say. And like I said, that comes from two different sources. It comes from study with regard to knowledge of things, because there's no limit to what you can study. It's easy, it's cheap. You just can obtain books or resources and study from your own desk. And then there's experience, where you can gather experience from the work that you do, from the places you go, from the people you know and talk to, and so on. You can gain experiences that make your communication valuable to other people. And I talked about this before. We also choose what our experience is. And I talked about how if you get a free night and you've got nothing to do, you can choose to just blow that time and goof around, or you can think about how you can make use of that time to do something useful, to learn something useful for the service and help of other people. So this idea of study is central to our Christian life. And that's why we see whole religious orders like the Dominicans organized around study, because it's actually a service to others if we go into it for the right reasons. So that's the first thing. You need to have something to say. You need to say what you mean. Sometimes you'll have a desire to express something. You'll have a thought of what you'd like to talk about, but you simply don't know enough about the subject to be able to talk about what you'd like to talk about. And that's the purpose of study. That's the purpose of research and so on. Okay. You may have something you want to talk about, and in order to talk about it, you're going to have to get a certain experience. You're going to have to go out and experience something, go someplace, see something, talk to someone. That's what reporters do, for example. If you look at journalists, news reporters, they want to be able to share the important news, what's going on in the world. And in order to do that, they've got to get in a plane or on a train or in a car, and they've got to go places where they can learn the details, talk to the people who are there, take pictures and video of the situation. They want to share the news. And in order to do that, they have to do something. They have to go and learn what's going on, get all the information, get the pictures, get the videos, get the interviews, and so on. You see, that's what journalists are doing. So we see in all different fields, this is what people are trying to do. They have something that they want to be able to say or to share or to do. And in order to do that, they've got to go and they've got to get the knowledge and experience to do that. So that's the first part of effective speaking and writing. And in our generation, because so few people actually study, so few people actually pursue valuable experiences, most people are just goofing around, playing. Because there are so few people who actually study important things and who gather important experience, if that's all that you have, you'll be successful in communication just because there's no competition. And the knowledge and experience that you share is so valuable to people. I'll give you a good example of this. I don't know if you know about this, but I publish videos that are called walk talks. And these videos are pretty popular. I get a lot of feedback from families. A lot of the families who come into the Classical Liberal Arts Academy learn about classical studies because of these talks that I do. And all that I do is I go out, out into the woods or out onto the street and take a walk. And I think of a topic or a question that someone has asked me. And I just turn the recorder on my phone on, literally on my phone. I just turn the recorder on and I walk and I answer the question or talk about the topic. I usually talk about it for 45 minutes or an hour, somewhere in there. And then I stop and I just publish the talk to YouTube. That's all I do. And those talks are pretty well received by people. I get lots of good feedback and they lead to more questions. And it's just that simple because there's no competition, because no one does things like that today. Everybody is doing the same boring things. They're doing the same boring activities. They're all, watching the same shows, playing the same games, reading the same, shallow books, that if you go a step beyond where everybody else is, you enter into an area where there's no one else even there. And the stuff that you learn and the experience that you gain, all you need to do is share it, because there's no competition for quality of communication. There's nothing. And I had to learn that because another speaker who I listen to, he encourages people to just start producing talks and videos and content, because really there's no competition, because everybody is so, not to be disrespectful, but because our society in general is so shallow and dumb that if you get into more advanced studies or some interesting topics or some unique skills, there's simply nobody else there who's talking about the same topics. And so if you get that knowledge and get into those fields, all you've got to do is produce content, because there's no one else producing any content. And people are desperate for more content and better content, but it's simply not being produced. And you guys can testify to this yourself. If you want to listen to music, where do you find good music? There's no good music being produced today, unless you're just listening to the normal modern radio junk. There's no real, who are today's composers? Who are the great artists of this generation? Who are the great philosophers or theologians of our generation? You can't even think of anybody. Most Catholic people, they can think of something like Like Father Mike Schmitz has a catechism program, and he's like famous all over the country, maybe even the world now, because what does he do? He reads the catechism in videos. That's what he does. He's not a philosopher. He's not some kind of theologian. He's not some amazing wise man. He simply reads the catechism and he has millions of followers. Why? Because nobody else does it. It's that simple. Nobody else does it. He did a read through the Bible in a year, got millions of followers. And just think of how silly that is. Somebody reads the Bible in a podcast, like a chapter or so a day, and they get millions of followers and all this crazy attention because they're just reading the Bible in a podcast. It's not like he's some kind of genius or wise man. He's just reading the Bible, and he gets millions of followers and all this attention because there's simply nobody doing anything other than barely surviving in modern society, doing all the same boring junk. And if you go beyond that, there's nobody else there, and it's very easy to be successful. So the first essential of writing and speaking is to have something to say, and you've got to go get it. You've got to make yourself valuable to others by studying and gaining experiences that give you something to say. That's the first thing. And it can be about anything that you're interested in. But if you just do the same thing everyone else is doing, which is what most people do, well, then you've got all of this competition because 1,000 people are already doing that. And that's your own fault because you're choosing to do things that no one needs, that are already taken care of. So have something valuable, have something interesting, have something helpful to say. If you have a desire to say something, do the research, gain the experience, do the study so that you can say what you mean to say. That's the first essential of expression, okay? The second is to say it clearly, and this is a different skill. The second skill is to say it clearly. So you can have the right ideas, you can have the good experience, and you can just share them. And like I said, because there's so little content being produced today because people are so lazy intellectually, spiritually, philosophically, practically. There's so little valuable content being produced that it's very easy to become successful and to enjoy success. But ultimately, you're going to want to communicate the things that you need to communicate effectively. And there's a couple different problems with the quality of communication. First of all, you can have good things to say and say them so poorly that no one wants to listen to them, or you actually cause them to appear to be false because you communicate them so poorly, right? So you can actually have lots of good ideas. You can know the solutions to things. You can have information that helps other people, but you communicate it so poorly that your communication actually becomes a barrier and an obstacle that prevents people from taking you seriously, and they don't listen to the information you have. And you have all experienced this in your own life. You've seen, for example, and I don't mean to pick on people, but this is the reality of rhetoric, okay? You can't go to church and have a giant obese priest talking about penance and fasting in Lent. His presentation and our personal character and appearance and all that kind of stuff is part of the art of rhetoric. You can't just say, oh no, we have to ignore that. No, people don't ignore that stuff, okay? If you don't brush your teeth and you have terrible breath and you've got, your teeth are black and you look like a monster, people are not really going to listen to what you have to say because you're gross. And that's a real part of rhetoric. And you can't just say, oh, well, you just got to tell them the truth. No wise man ever says that. And you yourself don't believe that. If you're listening to someone talk or watching something on whatever, for example, yesterday I saw BBC News has a reporter in Washington, D.C. who has only one eye. And I'm sitting there, hoping to get some news for the day, and I turn on BBC to get some news about what's going on in Ukraine, and a news reporter comes on and he's only got one eye, and I'm sorry, but all I can think about is one eye. That's what I, and so it's a distraction. You see, and that's a reality of rhetoric. That's a reality. Our personal character, how we look, how we talk, how we dress, how we behave, our reputation, all of these different things is a real part of our ability to communicate with others. And you know that by your experience. You can pretend, and you can pretend that you're a nice person and say, oh, well, I don't judge people by their appearance. And that can be true, but you still do judge people by their experience. Even if you say that you don't, you still do. And if it's in our control to avoid being a certain kind of person or looking a certain way or doing certain things that distracts people from our message, then it's our responsibility to take care of those things. And that's a part of rhetoric. It's called ethos. It's the influence of your own personal character on the audience that you're communicating with. So stuff like that is real. You guys know, you've seen videos that are really cheesy, or a movie where the acting is terrible. And it doesn't matter how good the story is. If the acting is bad, the movie stinks, and you spend more time laughing at the bad acting than paying attention to the actual message of the story. You know that by your own experience. I don't know if you watch any saint movies, but there are saint movies where they're produced in Italian or in Spanish. And then they do these voiceover versions of them where you watch them in English, and they're sort of reproduced where someone is just talking and they re-record the video with people talking over the original language in English. And the English versions are so cheesy and bad that you almost can't watch the movie anymore. I would rather watch it in Italian and not even know the words, because it's a better movie like that than to listen to the terrible English voiceovers, which make it seem so goofy and hard to listen to. You can watch movies where there's just one character who the actor or actress is so bad at acting that it distracts from the whole point of the story. That's a reality of communication and effective speaking and writing. So as a speaker and writer, you've got to think about those things. You've got to say what you want to say in a way that's effective. So having something to say, that's one part of it. That's one part of it. Saying it effectively is something totally different. It's a different part of it. It also determines what kind of way you try to communicate. For example, if you think about the fact that television has only been around for like maybe 70 or 80 years, you go back to like the 1950s when television became really popular and people started to actually have a television in their house. Before that, think about it. If there was a presidential election, most people learned about the candidates, learned about the different people running for president by listening to the radio. They didn't necessarily see the person. They didn't know what the person looked like. They didn't know how tall or short or skinny or fat the person was. They heard the person talking on the radio, and they made most of their decisions based on what they heard. And so you could have people run for president who are very intelligent, very persuasive, very good speakers, and they could win an election by the power of their speaking. All of a sudden in the 1960s, television became popular, and the political candidates had to be on television. So the debates and the speeches and all this stuff was on television. Well, now, all of a sudden, in order to become president, you couldn't just be a good talker, you also had to look good on television. And so the appearance of presidents or candidates who wanted to become president, their appearance became more important because people actually got to see them on television. And even if a person might be smarter or a better candidate, if he got on television and looked like an orc, he wouldn't get any votes. And so we see in the 1960s, we see that John F. Kennedy wins the presidential election. And one of the reasons why he was so successful was because he was a young, good-looking guy. and that helped him to win the presidency. Whereas 20 years before, that would have never influenced anything. So you can see how different ways of communicating, writing, speaking, being on video and television, there are reasons why you would choose different forms of communication based on your strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, you could be a person who's very smart, has great information to share, but just by nature, you've got a terrible voice. Your voice doesn't sound good, when you speak publicly, or if you record yourself talking, your voice doesn't sound good. Well, then audio might not be a good idea for you. You might want to be a writer instead and just concentrate all of your attention on writing, because if you write great stuff, somebody else can read it. So you can be a writer. And there are people, in all fields where what they do is they write. If you watch a guy on television and he's like a comedian or a talk show host, and he's got all these jokes that he tells, there are people behind the scenes writing those jokes, funny people who can't be the guy on the TV show. And so they write the jokes and give them to the handsy, funny, interesting guy who's actually on the television screen. They're the writers, and he presents the jokes. So there's different ways of expressing our ideas, different ways of doing things, and based on our own strengths and weaknesses, we can choose to use different means of communication. And that's a part of effective communicating for us, to choose the means that best serve our interests. So that's something to think about. You can write, you can record video, you can do audio, and you've got to choose what's most effective. So the first part of essential communication, essentials of expression. The first part is you've got to have something to say, and that comes as a result of study and experience. But the second part is you've got to say it effectively, and that's a completely different study with lots of different things to think about. Your personal character, what people know about you, what people think about you, what people know about your background, what people know about, things that you've accomplished. All of those things affect how people listen to you. And that's part of effective expression, is gaining respect because of your character. That's one part of it. Learning how to communicate to other people, respecting emotional effects and things like that. For example, if you're at a funeral and you see someone at the funeral who you haven't seen in a long time, it's not a good time to go up and talk about the baseball game, right? Just because you have something to talk about, the timing is not right. The environment is not the right place or time to talk about that topic. So not only is there a need to know what to say, there's also a need to know when to say it, how to say it, and so on. So it gets more complicated. So we've got the ethos, or the effect of our character and the way we talk or the way we look, what people know about us, and so on, that affects our ability to communicate effectively. We've also got emotional situations to think about, and how our message will be received based on its emotional effect, based on the details of time and place and what's going on and things like that. And then thirdly, the quality of our evidence, the quality of our arguments. If we're trying to persuade someone of something, all of the arguments and the evidence and all that kind of stuff, that all needs to be figured out beforehand. And so in order for us to communicate clearly, we've got to have all that stuff worked out beforehand. And so that's the challenge of having something to say and then saying it effectively. Those are two very different things. And we've got to, if we're going to be good communicators, we've got to learn how to do both of those things. Have something valuable to say. That's in your control as far as studying and gaining experience goes. And then communicating it effectively, that's a complex challenge, because there's so many different ways to communicate, so many different times to communicate, so many different influences on how other people receive our communication. And if we're going to be wise about it, we've got to learn to take all of those things into consideration. And again, that's the point of the study of rhetoric. So If that thought is interesting to you, and you say, wow, that sounds like a really fascinating study, learning how, or learning the art of effective communication by learning about all these different things, being able to make good decisions in um, all these different situations and times and places and different people we're talking to, how we should talk to them, what we should say, what we should not say, when we should say it, and so on. If you find that really interesting, well, that's what we study in the art of rhetoric. That's what that study is. And so for rhetoric, we've got to learn about all those kinds of things. We have to learn about human emotions. We have to learn about what kinds of things people desire, what kind of things persuade people, what kind of things get people excited, what kind of things get people upset, and so on. So it joins together with ethics and moral philosophy, where we start to understand why people do the stuff that they do and what they're trying to accomplish. And we learn how to control our communication based on the people that we're talking to, and what we think would work or not work. And you already do this naturally as human beings because you're reasonable. You know that if you want something, let's say you want something, right? There's something you want, and you're going to have to talk to someone in order to get it. You know that if your brother has it or your sister has it, and you're going to talk to your brother or sister and try to get it, you're going to talk in one way. But if your parents have it, if your father has it, or if your mother has it, you're going to talk in a different way to try and get it. You know, there's a good time to talk to dad, and there's a bad time to talk to dad. You know, there's a good time to talk to mom, and there's a bad time to talk to mom. You know, there's a certain tone of voice that you should use when you talk to mom. There's a certain tone of voice you should use when you talk to dad, and a different tone of voice will work when you talk to your brother or your sister. And you already know those things just because you're rational, and you already do those things. Kids are very clever. You know that little kids, 3 and 4-year-old kids already have a lot of this stuff figured out. They know how to throw a tantrum, for example, because they know that if they throw a tantrum, mommy will come running in and give them anything they want to get them to quiet down and stop it. But if daddy's there, well, then the tantrum might not work, right? Because daddy may pick that kid up and go put him in the crib in his room and shut the door. So we learn that kind of stuff from the time we're infants and toddlers. We learn to think about who we're talking about, what the topic is, what's effective in this situation, and we do those things naturally. But when it's time to talk to adults or talk to a crowd, we often stop thinking like that, and we get intimidated by the pressure, or we're afraid because of the consequences, and we actually start to do dopey things that don't make any sense, rather than simply continuing to think about the rhetorical details of different audiences and situations, which we understood when we were 4 years old. So this whole idea of rhetoric and effective communication is very natural. We have to learn, though, that we can't allow our anxieties or our nerves or fear or anything like that to actually cause us to stop communicating rationally. And that's one of the problems when we have to talk to a crowd or an audience, or try to say something that is awkward, or there's a lot of pressure, like a job interview, and maybe you've got this one opportunity for a really great job, and you get nervous, and you go into the interview and you act unreasonably because you're influenced by nerves and anxiety and things like that. We have to learn how to control all those things. We have to learn how to communicate effectively, use reason, act according to the art and principles of rhetoric, and communicate well. And it's difficult to do that when we're under pressure and we're nervous, or we're self-conscious, or we doubt ourselves, or we're unprepared. We haven't done enough study yet. We don't have enough experience yet. And, we go into those situations and struggle. So all of these things are in our control. All of these things are in our control. And people who are master communicators, it's because they do all the work beforehand. So when they stand on the stage, when they make the video, when they do the recording, they've done all the work. They've got everything ready. They've thought through all the rhetorical questions and details, and they know exactly what they need to do, and they can go after it and pursue it. And when they finish the talk, or they finish the essay, or finish the article, or finish the book, whatever it is, they can know that they've done what needed to be done, and then they leave it for the audience to judge. And the audience isn't reliable, because sometimes audiences just make the wrong choices. So having these two things in our mind and keeping it simple like this helps us. We have to have something to say. We have to say what we mean, or we have to figure out how to say what we mean. We have to actually learn it and know what needs to be said. But then we've got to also say it clearly or effectively. We've got to communicate it effectively. And there's lots of ways to communicate things effectively. And that's not determined by what we want to say necessarily. Sometimes saying it clearly or saying it effectively is completely dependent on who we're saying it to, when we're saying it, what the circumstances are, how we're saying it in terms of what form of communication we're going to use, and so on. Sometimes a phone call, sometimes an email, sometimes a text message, sometimes a video, sometimes a book, sometimes an article. There's all different situations that require different forms of communication. And you can see why this teaches you that you have to learn to use as many different forms of communication as possible, because that helps you to communicate more effectively with different audiences in different circumstances for different purposes, and so on. And then on top of that, you're going to learn that there are some forms of communication that you're really good at, and there are others that you really stink at. And you have to choose to either avoid the ones you stink at, or practice and study and discipline yourself to learn to become good at them. So all of those challenges come with this study of composition and rhetoric. Okay, lots and lots to talk about, lots and lots to think about. And this concern here really needs to become, practically speaking, these two issues, they need to become the focus of all of your studies. This is really what you're studying for. This is what you should be thinking about and trying to accomplish in your studies. I've got to know what to say. I've got to have knowledge and understanding. I've got to have experience. I've got to know what to say. I've got to actually have answers to questions. I've got to have solutions to problems. I need to know what to say to be valuable to other people. And I also need to work and practice and discipline myself to say it well, because I may have the truth and say it poorly and cause it to look like it's false. And many people do this. We have, if you go on YouTube or look on the internet, you'll find people who present themselves as like defenders of the Catholic faith. Anybody who signs up for a YouTube channel decides that he's a defender of the Catholic faith, and they'll get into arguments with people in debates and videos. No one has asked them to do that. The church has not appointed them to represent the faith or anything like that. And they'll get in these debates or on these videos, and they'll lose the debates because they're not very smart. They're not good at debating. They'll lose the debates and actually cause the truth to appear to be false, simply because they are not good at communicating, or they don't have the answers and don't know what to say, but they're zealous to get themselves into the spotlight and try to pretend that they're some kind of apostle or, great debater or master of the faith. And they're not. And they actually cause the opponents of Catholicism to think that they're right. And you can think about that. That's a pretty evil thing to do, to actually cause people who are in error to walk away from the discussion actually more confident that their error is right, because you've done such a terrible job communicating the truth. So this can be very serious, and it's why we need to sort of, resist the selfish desire to always make ourselves the representative, because if we do a bad job at representing, we can actually be responsible for causing people to live in unbelief. And, in other areas too, not just religion, but in practical things as well. If there's a doctor who knows the true remedy for a problem, but he's such a bad communicator that his patients don't trust him and no one listens. He can actually cause the people to avoid the right remedy just because they don't like the doctor. So you can think about those things. There are moral responsibilities we have that we can actually cause people harm by talking about topics that we're not prepared to talk about, or talking about them in ways that we're not effective using, and things like that. So there's also a moral responsibility in communication. Sometimes we have to know when it's time to let other people talk about an issue. And it's difficult sometimes because we're passionate about an issue or a topic. We want to talk about it, but we might not be the right person to give that message. So all of these things are considered in the art of rhetoric. And as I was saying, for your daily studies, these are the two things you should be thinking about. What do I need to study to make myself helpful and useful to other people? What do I need to study to make myself happy, to be able to live happily in this life? What do I need to study? What do I need to know? That should be driving your studies, not what's required for my high school diploma, not what's required so I can get a job, not what's required to get some credits for those things are not what should be directing our studies. Because if you pursue the things you really should pursue, all of those things will take care of themselves. If you aim at those low things, you're going to achieve even less. If you aim for the higher things, you'll achieve those lower things. So you should never really worry about those things. They take care of themselves. If you study the right stuff for the right reasons, all of the paperwork will take care of itself. And you should be thinking about that as you study. And it doesn't matter what your interests are. You know, my interests are philosophy, classical studies, and religion. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I study. That's what I have studied for almost 30 years now. You're going to have your own interests, your own skills, your own opportunities, but the same responsibility to study, to become helpful to other people in those areas. And it doesn't matter what it is. You could say, I want to be a lawyer. Well, then you should devote yourself to studying, to becoming a helpful, useful, wise lawyer. That's what you should study for. You could say, I want to be a doctor. Same thing. You could say, I want to be a farmer. Same thing. It doesn't matter what your interests are. You're going to find the same thing is necessary for you to succeed in that thing. You've got to study to have something to say by means of your studies and your experience that's in your control for you to get. And then as you learn all of that, you get the wisdom, you get the experience, you learn the truth of the topics you want to talk about and work with. Then you have to learn how to communicate them effectively, because even though you get a license to be a plumber, that doesn't mean that you get any customers, because getting customers and installing plumbing are two totally different things, and yet they're both necessary for business. Just because you become a doctor and get a medical license doesn't mean you get patients signing up to come to your office and pay you for their services. Just because you have the degree doesn't mean you're successful in that field. That's a totally different challenge. I'm a classicist. I earned awards and stuff studying classics in college. Just because I know classics doesn't mean that I'm able to be a teacher, because if I have no families or students interested in having me teach, nobody cares what my studies were, because I'm not a good teacher. So the knowledge and the ability to communicate the knowledge are two totally different things. And in order to be successful in whatever you want to be successful in, and this applies to every field imaginable, you're going to have the skill and have the knowledge, but you're also going to need to be able to communicate it effectively. You're going to have to do both things. And that's where most people mess up. They'll say, well, I want to be an electrician. So they focus on being an electrician. They say, I'm not going to study. I don't care about schoolwork. I don't care about writing and all this kind of stuff. I just want to be an electrician. Well, what happens to those people is they become an electrician, and that's great, but they're dependent on somebody else to do all the business work for them. And so they spend their life just looking for a job because they need someone else to find customers, to get work, to advertise, to win jobs, all that kind of stuff. They leave that for somebody else to do. and they make themselves dependent on getting a job, and it's nobody else's business to get you a job. And that's what you've got to understand. No one else is responsible to do that work for you so that you can get a paycheck when you're not willing to do that work. No one is going to be interested in doing that for you. And that's why business owners, the people who do that work, who do all the advertising and they do all the work of figuring out how to run the business and make it profitable, the business owners who do all that, they're not interested in making their employees rich or finding work for their employees. They're trying to figure out how to make their own business as effective and as profitable as possible. And if they can replace you with machines, if they can replace you with computer programs or with cheaper workers, that's what they're going to do. They're not interested in fighting for you to have a job. So if you choose to pursue a skill or an area of expertise, but you neglect all of the other things, all of the responsibility of communication, you're going to set yourself up to be a person who's dependent on someone else creating jobs, and no one is going to be interested in creating jobs for you. They're going to do all the work while you just punch in, work the minimum amount of time, and then punch out at the end of the day for a paycheck. They're not going to be interested in working more and more and more so that you can have an easy paycheck. And if you take that approach, you're going to put yourself in danger of being out of work. And that's what we find many people doing. You may be lucky and you may be successful and may be able to live your whole life and never have a problem, but that's not in your control because you've made yourself dependent on other people working to provide you with work, and you just can't depend on those things. You could say, well, I just want to be a teacher in a public school. I just want to be a teacher in a school. I just want to go get a job. Well, you don't even know if schools are going to exist in 20 years, especially with things going online and kids being able to study from home and things like that. You don't even know if those jobs are going to exist. And if they do exist, there might be only a few jobs here and there, and it's going to be very difficult to get those jobs. And those jobs are not going to go to people who can't communicate. So you're going to be back in the same problem. So no matter what your interest is, no matter what your interest is, you have to pursue expertise in that area of interest, whether it's religion, philosophy, any kind of business, any kind of profession you're interested. You've got to study to become so skilled in that area that you have valuable knowledge and experience to share with people to make you valuable. But then you've also got to learn all of these basic skills of effective communication, or you're going to be stuck with a bunch of knowledge that you can't communicate, and that's useless, okay? It's like having all kinds of skill in carpentry, but you have no arms, right? How useful is that carpentry skill if it's all in your head, but you can't actually make anything with it? So that's what it's like to have skill or to have knowledge in an area, but be poor at communication. It just wastes all of that knowledge and experience you have. So you've got to commit to learning both. And when you look at the classical liberal arts, you look at grammar, reasoning, rhetoric, you look at moral philosophy, all of these subjects, that's the purpose of these subjects. They're necessary for anybody. So you could say, why do I have to study grammar? Why do I have to study this? I just want to work in carpentry. I just want to be a farmer. I just want to be a mechanic. Well, you're going to need to communicate effectively in any kind of work you do. And if you don't study those arts, you're not going to be able to communicate well. That's the point. So the ideal is to have both, to have a classical liberal arts education and to have your own modern area of interest that you'd like to devote your life to, whatever it may be, and bring those two things together. That's what actually gives you the opportunity to be successful. And again, I'll offer myself as an example. I studied classics and ancient history and philosophy because that was my delight. That's what I wanted to devote my whole life to. But in order to actually have a career and provide for my life, I had to learn how to build and design websites. I had to learn how to make videos. I had to learn how to do audio recordings. I had to learn how to write articles. I had to learn to take phone calls from people and do all of the work of business management, which has nothing to do with what I was interested in. But in order for you to develop a life for yourself, doing what you're interested in, you have to learn how to do both of those things. You have to learn how to pursue your own special interest, and you also have to learn how to handle business and taxes and advertising and communicating and all these kinds of things in order to be successful in that field. And that's where most kids mess up. They don't study both things. They think they're just going to focus on what they're interested in, and then they leave all those other skills neglected, and they find there's nothing that they can do. So what you'll see as a person goes to college and they study philosophy, and they get a philosophy degree from college, they have no business skills, no communication skills, no professional skills, and you find that they go get a job selling mobile phones at Verizon with a degree in philosophy, because they have no way to actually take their skill and their knowledge and figure out how to use it effectively in adult life. So you'll see people with degrees, all kinds of degrees, doing jobs for a paycheck that have nothing to do with what they're interested in. And that's because they didn't pursue both. They didn't have something to say and also learn how to communicate it effectively. We have to do both of those things. And if I was going to criticize modern Christian society, this would be my criticism. Christians often claim to be interested in religion and culture and philosophy and education and all these things. But when it's time to actually put that to work, they're not interested in doing that worldly stuff. They're not interested in the worldly stuff because they want to pretend that they're so spiritual, or they're so philosophical, or they're so interested in great culture. They don't have time for, but that practical stuff, that's where the work actually gets done. And here's a little challenge I'd like to give you. If you study the lives of the saints, think of whoever your favorite saints are, whatever saints you admire. You could take, like, my favorite saints, because I work in education, my favorite saints are people like John Bosco, Thomas Aquinas, people who worked in education. They're the saints that I admire them most, because I can look at their lives and appreciate what they did. But if you look at the lives of saints, you'll find that they were not the kind of people who studied and then didn't do practical things. You'll find that saints are very practical people. Saints were people who saw problems in the world, in their generation, studied and worked and prayed to gain the solution to those problems, and then they actually brought the solution into real life by doing real practical work. So just think about it. Saint Francis was upset because there was corruption and materialism in the church. So what did he do? Did he sit in his office and fuss about it? Did he sit at a desk and just cry, alone in his bedroom all day long? No, that's not what St. Francis did. St. Francis went and physically rebuilt a church. That's what St. Francis did. He created a religious community, created a rule for life, found other men who were willing to join him, and women, started a religious order, built his own chapel, and he created a solution in the real world. You look at John Bosco. John Bosco was upset because there were boys just left in the streets all day with nothing to do. They were neglected by their parents, by their society. They were taken advantage of by business owners who used them and didn't pay them. They got into all kinds of crime and sin because they were loose in the streets. Well, John Bosco was upset about that. What did he do? Did he start a website where he writes all of his complaints? Did he go on Twitter and complain about everything? No, he actually started his own schools and went out into the streets and invited the boys to come and stay with him. He gave them food, he gave them clothes, he taught them, he ended up giving them places to live and stay, and he solved a practical problem by doing the practical work. He had to deal with all kinds of laws, he had to raise money. You think a priest is interested in raising money? No, of course not. But that's what had to be done, and he was willing to do it. Padre Pio. Padre Pio was upset that modern science and medicine was just becoming materialistic. No one talked about religion anymore. They thought that all you need is scientists and doctors to give you medicine. So what does he do? He builds his own hospital. He raises thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars and does all the work necessary to build his own hospital where people can be treated in the right way according to Catholic principles. He did that. He worked to make that solution possible. And you can go through the lives of the saints, and this is what you'll see. They're not people who just sit around studying religion. They're not people who just sit in a field, plucking flowers. They're people who actually looked at the world, saw problems, did whatever work was necessary in their own lives to become able to solve the problems, and then they went and they figured out how to do whatever was necessary to solve that problem in real life. Another good example in modern times, if you know Mother Angelica from EWTN, the television station, she was a Franciscan nun who was upset that there was so little culture and teaching for Catholics in America that she figured out how to start her own television station. And now, it's one of the biggest television stations in the world. That was figured out by an old lady who was a Franciscan nun. You think that when she became a Franciscan, she was interested in learning how to start a television program or build a television studio and a television station? Obviously, that's not what she was interested in, but practically, that's what was necessary for her to communicate what she had to say effectively. And she was willing to do the practical work. That's what the lives of the saints teach us. They're not just these, talking heads that have opinions about things. They actually figure out how to develop real solutions in the real world. That's the real challenge. It's these two things: have something to say, but also say it and communicate it effectively so it can have its effects and have its fruits. Those two things. So in chapter 4 here in this lesson, I'm going to wrap up real quick. In chapter 4, that's what we learn. We learn that for effective communication of any kind, not just writing, we've got to keep these two things in mind. How can I learn what to say? How can I figure out how to find the solutions, how to answer the questions, how to solve the problems, how to teach what needs to be taught? And then secondly, practically, in my generation, in my real life circumstances, how can I effectively accomplish that and do that? Not just so that I can accomplish my goals, but also how I can earn a living. I mean, that's real life. In order to do things, you're going to have to figure out how to do them in a sustainable way where you can actually earn what you need to live on. You're not a robot. You don't get free food because you decide to do some good work. You still have to pay all your bills. So in order to manage both of those things and be realistic in this life, we have to learn how to have something to say and also how to say it effectively. So that's the point of this fourth lesson. I hope that's helpful. If you're interested in that second part of learning how to communicate effectively, realize that that's the study of rhetoric. Okay, so if you're interested in that, there's a whole source of teaching that guides you through all of those topics. That's really interesting, and you can study that in the academy with me. So that's it for today. Have something to say and say it effectively. That's the challenge of communication. That's the goal of our studies, the goal of our life, and you can do it. You have to figure out what it is that you're interested in, that you want to do, make yourself helpful in that area, and then learn how to actually bring that into real life work by learning how to communicate it and do it effectively. That's what business is. All right. So I hope that's helpful. That's all for today. If you have no questions, you're free to go. If there's anything you'd like to ask or chat about real quick, I'll hang out until I see everyone disappear. So I'll catch you next time. God bless everybody.